Dear friends, we are into the next lecture that is on Linux operating system. So let's get started. So this is a logo of Linux operating system. Okay, a penguin. There's a story behind. I will leave you to make a self-study on it. Why this particular logo? Okay, the Linux operating system was developed in 1991 by a degree student called Linus Torvalds, like any of you. Uh, it is a multi-user, we have seen, time-sharing, open source software, which is free to download, modify, distribute. So it comes into the class of FOSS. In 1991, Linus wanted to get the Unix operating system that was popular, which was a multi-user time-sharing operating system that time, but that was expensive. So he thought of creating his own operating system, and he gave it to the world to work on it. That's why we have from the Unix and the Linux were the Linux operating system, and it is based on the FOSS philosophy, and it's becoming also popular for the PC computer market, and it is a layer based operating system. That's why it has got high level of security and control. All right, so now when we look at the Linux environment, there are different versions of Linux. Why different versions? There is something called, we will see, a kernel and the external part of the Linux. The kernel is centrally created, but the remaining parts can be added, modified by anyone. So there are popular Linux versions called Red Hat. This is a Red Hat Linux. We have Ubuntu Linux. We have SUSE Linux. This is a logo for SUSE. This is a Fedora Linux. This and others are popular. We'll leave it to find out. Then we also have, India had a common version which was becoming popular some years before, called the Bharat Operating System Solutions, BOS. It's also a Linux based operating system, and this all work on the philosophy of the FOSS, free and open source software. Alright, now this is an important question, the structure of Linux. It's important to understand why the Linux has this credibility and reliability, because it's because of its layered architecture. So Linux has got different layers. So we have the innermost in any system is its hardware that we the user like to use, and the hardware is at the center. Now in the Linux operating system, it is a layered base. Innermost layer is called the kernel, then we have shell, then we have utilities and users we are here. So the kernel, which is the center, the core of the Linux operating system, that has got, it consists of different primitive basic operations that are part of the operating system. That is, in Linux everything is called a process, a task is called a process. So creating, suspending, termination of a process, etc., is done at this level, at the kernel. Then we have a shell as a program, of course, the term does, it's like a protection. It protects the kernel from other external users and utilities. So it translates, it does a task of translating the commands to the kernel. So it's like a command interpreter. It acts like an interface between the kernel and users. Then we have the utilities. The utilities, they include various programs like compilers, editors, translators, where programming compilers are here when you need to program. So that is the utilities. Then we have the user. So a user interacts with either utilities or through shell to the kernel. Now when you work on the Linux operating system, there are two levels that a person Linux allows access. The first is called a user mode, and the next higher level is called a kernel mode. In a user mode, we have limited privileges, access, rights to the system. But at kernel mode, it is like a supervisor, administrator of the system, has got complete access and able to modify. So these layered and these levels of access provides and creates, gives us this better access and controls in case of a Linux operating system. So this is an important question, very often asked. Now let's go to the Advantages of Linux. As we have seen, Linux is based on the FOSS philosophy, free open source software. So you are the total owner of it, you buy it, you have it, you can copy, modify, distribute, and free, not expensive, unlike Windows. Then security is much better and it is virus free. Linux, this is what makes Linux most popular, free from virus and higher security. Windows system, whereas virus prone we saw, Linux can wipe away many virus that affects, let's say, a pen drive or a system in a Windows environment, just taking them into a Linux computer, and you can delete those viruses just like files. Then it avoids unnecessary crashes and restarts. Windows has got many restarts and crashes often, but Linux is more reliable and robust in that way. Hardware is much more reliable and resources are used to the optimum in a Linux environment. Then Linux is not so resource hungry, which means system specification required are very low and there is a high level of multitasking possible here. Then going into the limitations, for of course, for an academic purpose, these are some disadvantages. For most new and popular hardware that come out, sometimes the device drivers lack. We have seen what is a device driver, so this makes it difficult to work with Linux, some hardware systems. Then the learning curve is steep in Linux, meaning for a new user, first time user, Windows is much more easier for starters. Linux makes it at a higher level because it is done by programmers for high-end programmers, so there are some difficulties at the learning level starting beginners. But though at present there are many popular desktop versions of Linux that come out are much more user friendly, GUI based and user friendly. Then most popular softwares, we do not have an alternative in the Linux environment. Take it Photoshop, etc., are more into the Windows environment. Then if you are more hungry for games and multimedia, of course this Linux environment stands a little low at this level in games and multimedia. So we have seen here Linux as an operating system, versions of Linux, architecture, advantage, disadvantage. Alright, let me now go to something that is of interest to you. Alright, why this movement? Read what is written below. I need you to write up an assignment which you can submit online, minimum or maximum 500 words about Android and iOS. You know, Android is used in most mobiles as an operating system, and iOS into the Apple environment. Make a little write up about this too. Okay, so it's not there in your syllabus, but sometimes being current topics can be asked. So a small write up, a one-page write up, you can submit it online on your Google Classroom, and please type it. Do not copy and paste. I hope you learn. Thank you. God bless.